Hey, what's going on everyone? Greg here, and I've seen your comments on YouTube and Twitter, and I know so many of you are wondering not only what size MacBook Pro you should buy, but also what exact configuration you should order, because Apple has made this process so incredibly confusing. It is not your fault. There are more processor options than ever before. So for this video, I want to do my best to give you a buyer's guide on what MacBook Pro you should order, especially if you're impatient like me and want to pre-order one of these laptops. And I want to give you some honest advice on what configuration you should get, and even if you should order this specific MacBook Pro. Also, full disclosure before we start this video, I, or anyone else for that matter, does not have one of these MacBook Pros. So we have to make a lot of assumptions here when we're talking about different configurations, and we have to try and read between the lines and also take Apple at their word for some of their graphs and comparisons. So ultimately, if you want more accurate buying advice, I would highly recommend you wait for full reviews of this product before you put your order in. But I know my audience, and I know half of you already ordered this thing before I even finished the sentence. And I also know a lot of you are watching this video that aren't subscribed right now, and I think I need like 5 more subscribers before I reach 200,000. So come on, do me a favor and get subscribed to the channel already. All right, so traditionally in my buyer's guide videos, I would go over every spec of the MacBook Pro, but I kind of did that in yesterday's video. So if you want a detailed breakdown of what's new in these MacBooks, watch that video first. For this video, I'm going to focus more on the advantages for going with a MacBook Pro and trying my best to break down what's different between certain specifications. So let's start with the 14-inch MacBook Pro because there's some important distinctions here. So first of all, from a feature perspective, it's important to note that the 14-inch Pro gets all of the same features as the 16-inch MacBook Pro. So both laptops get a mini LED 120Hz ProMotion display, 1080p camera, 6 speakers, the same amount of ports, the same pixels per inch, and both computers can mostly be maxed out with the same internals, including the 10-core CPU and 32-core GPU M1 Max chip with 64 gigabytes of memory and 8 terabytes of storage. So the main difference between the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro is obviously size and battery. So the 14-inch MacBook Pro weighs in at 3.5 pounds. It's actually slightly thinner than the older 13-inch model, but it also does have a slightly bigger physical footprint. The 16-inch is actually a little bit smaller than the previous 16-inch MacBook Pro in terms of its physical size, but it weighs more. It weighs 4.7 pounds, and strangely enough, if you order it with the Max configuration chip, it actually weighs 4.8 pounds. And the 16-inch MacBook Pro also has more battery life, with Apple saying it is up to 21 hours of video playback and 14 hours of wireless web, while the 14-inch is rated at 17 hours of video playback and 11 hours of wireless web, which is actually worse than the M1 MacBook Pro. So these differences are notable with the 16-inch version. It weighs more than the 14-inch, and obviously because of its bigger size, it will be less portable, so it'll take up more space on a table or in your bag. And if you want to be portable, you should go for the 14-inch. If you want the screen real estate, you should go for the 16-inch. And if you care about having the biggest battery possible, well, then you should also really consider that 16-inch model. Another thing to note here is the different power supplies. So there's actually 3 different power supplies for the MacBook Pro. So if you order the lowest end MacBook Pro, you actually get a 67-watt USB-C power adapter. This is because the lowest end MacBook Pro actually ships with a weaker CPU, which has 6 high-performance cores instead of 8, and a 14-core GPU, so it requires less power to run at full speed. But if you really want that 96-watt power supply, you can add it on for an additional $20, which could provide a faster charge to this MacBook Pro, but every other configuration of the 14-inch MacBook Pro does come with the 96-watt power supply. The 16-inch MacBook Pro comes with a massive 140-watt power supply as standard. You can't get it with a weaker one, and this thing looks massive. Now, one thing to note here is that although you can charge both MacBook Pros with USB-C still, if you want the fastest charging speeds on the 16-inch MacBook Pro, you actually have to use the MagSafe charging port because USB-C cables currently max out at 100 watts of charging, and it's possible if you're running the 16-inch MacBook Pro at full power, you may actually lose power if you're charging it through the USB-C port. So to get full 140 watts of charging, For now, you have to use MagSafe. Now, with those differences out of the way, let's look at specific configurations, because the 14-inch model has, I can't believe I'm saying this, 5 total CPU configurations. First of all, the 14-inch base model, which starts at $2,000, comes with a weaker processor and a weaker GPU. So it only comes with 6 high-performance cores instead of 8, and 2 energy-efficient cores. The GPU has 14 cores instead of 16. Now, I'm not sure how this will compare in performance to the, true M1 Pro with an 8-core processor, but I will say if you need really good multi-core performance, even though I'm sure this chip will perform really well because it's just going to be a better version of the M1 chip, which is already good, if I cared about multi-core performance a lot, I would definitely spend the extra money on the 10-core CPU option. Now, the interesting thing to note here is that even with the $200 add-on, you are not getting the full power of the M1 Pro chip, because it's still just a 14-core GPU rather than the Max 16-core GPU. And just to throw this in there as an interesting comparison, even though the 14-inch MacBook Pro starts at $2,000 and the 16-inch starts at $2,500, but the real difference in price is actually just $200, because the 16-inch Pro starts with a 10-core CPU and 16-core GPU, which is an additional $300 option on the 14-inch model. So if you were just worried about pricing between the 14 and 16-inch models, realize that they are actually a lot closer in price than they appear. So these are hard decisions to make right now, and you kind of have to try and judge which kind of performance you need and how much money you're willing to spend. There isn't a magic one-answer solution for every user watching this video, and all I can do is provide you with the differences we know from this page. But I will say, I think most users will actually be fine with any of these M1 Pro configurations, even the base model one. However, there is one limitation you should consider, and that is that the M1 Pro chips can only be configured up to 32 gigabytes of unified memory. So if you need a lot of memory for whatever program you're running, you need to get the Max chip to upgrade to 64 gigabytes. I'll also note that the M1 Max chips have to be configured with at least 32 gigabytes of memory. So even though it says a $500 increase for this chip, it's actually a $900 increase because you are forced into 32 gigabytes of memory even if you don't want it. Another important thing to note with these Max chips is that they are only improvements to the GPU, to the graphics of the computer. The CPU is exactly the same on a maxed out M1 Pro and a maxed out M1 Max. So if you don't care about GPU performance and you're fine with a max of 32 gigabytes of memory, do not get the Max chip. Furthermore, there's 2 different configurations for the Max chip, one with a 24-core GPU and one with a 32-core GPU. So let's say you really only care about processor speed, but you absolutely need 64 gigabytes of memory for this computer. Well, make sure you don't get the more expensive Max chip, because the only improvement there is in GPU cores. And if you're like me and you want the best GPU possible that supposedly is around the power of an NVIDIA 3080, well, that's when you gotta go for the big Max 32-core GPU option, the most expensive Max chip. Now, like I said earlier, the 16-inch model can be configured exactly the same way, and it starts with a 10-core CPU and 16-core GPU. So it only has one M1 Pro configuration and 2 M1 Max configurations. Now, there are some other differences you should know about before you decide between the M1 Pro and M1 Max. For example, the M1 Pro can only drive 2 external displays at a time, while the M1 Max can max out at 4 external displays. So if you need more than 2 external displays, you need to get the Max chip. As for whether there's a power advantage on the 16-inch model, the only thing I can say right now is I just don't know. We don't have the information right now. Apple isn't saying there is. But if you look at the 16-inch, you'll notice it's a little bit thicker, and it's also a bigger laptop, so it should have a better thermal design because there's more room to dissipate heat. So even though both the 14 and 16-inch technically come with the same chips, the jury is out on whether or not the 14-inch will thermal throttle more than the 16-inch, so we can find that out when we actually get our hands on these MacBooks, whether or not there's a difference, or maybe there's like a very minor difference. We just don't know. Now, if you're having trouble deciding between which GPU you should get, Apple does have some comparisons between different programs on their website that you should probably try and scroll through to see if their improvement claims are in programs that you use. So for me, they are claiming with the Max GPU, I would see a 13.4x improvement compared to the old 13-inch Intel MacBook Pro, and a 2.9x improvement compared to the 16-inch MacBook Pro with a Radeon Pro 5600M. And looking at this comparison, it just strikes me that the GPU in both the M1 Pro and M1 Max are both really good, so you might be fine saving money and just going for the M1 Pro. Because look at this performance. The M1 Pro is beating out the top-end 16-inch MacBook Pro in performance by 1.7x. So you don't even need to get the Max chip to beat out the old 16-inch MacBook Pro, which had a discrete graphics card. And another thing to note here is that it's all program-based. So, let's say you don't use your computer for Final Cut and you use Photoshop all day. Well, look at the chart. You're only seeing a 0.1x improvement in GPU accelerated filters between the M1 Pro and M1 Max. So my best advice is to go through all of these comparison charts, note what you do on your computer, and this should try and help making out choosing between the M1 Pro and M1 Max a little bit easier. Now, I should note that the 14-inch MacBook Pro, again, starts at $2,000, but if you want to max it out with 8 terabytes of storage, an M1 Max chip, and 64 gigabytes of memory, the total is $5,899, and then for the 16-inch with that same specification, that will run you $6,099. Now, like I said, and as you've probably realized, this upgrade process is more complex, deciding between these processors than any other Apple launch that I have covered. There's just too many unknowns about the performance of these M1 Pro and M1 Max chips right now. However, I will try my best to give some general advice because I think even though these are pro laptops, a lot of consumer-level individuals will be drawn over to these laptops for features like the better mini LED display with 120Hz ProMotion, better speakers, the new design, and let's face it, there's going to be people that walk into an Apple store without needing a lick of this M1 Pro's power and see the ports on this laptop compared to any of the other Macs, and they're just gonna buy it. So if that sounds like you don't do anything pro on your computer like video editing, development, music production, 3D modeling, whatever, then I would recommend the base model. And any of the power you would get would be wasted on you in any of these other chip configurations. So spend as little money as possible if you are not using this for true high-end tasks. And then obviously make sure you configure it with as much storage as you think you'll need. That's the only thing that maybe you'll want to spend more money on is if you need a terabyte of storage or 2 terabytes, you should definitely spend money on that now. And then for memory, if you're a normal user like I just described, 16 gigabytes is going to be more than enough. I don't know, maybe if you have every single application open, then splurge on 32. For people that do need more power, realize that there's a good possibility that even the base chip will probably serve you extremely well. The M1 has served me well, and this is a more powerful version of the M1 with a better CPU and a better GPU. So even though it's not the best, M1 Pro configuration, it might serve you well. And you might not actually have to spend more money to get any of these higher end CPU or GPU options. And this is a good choice if you are on a strict budget. Whether or not you need the better CPU or GPU is a decision you have to make, but one thing I can recommend is that most users using this for pro tasks like video editing, I would recommend stepping up to the 32 gigabytes of memory. Even though the 16 gigabyte base memory is fine for most users, chances are you're buying this because the M1 machines weren't enough for you, and one of the limitations with the M1 was the 16 gigabytes of memory. So if you need it for pro tasks, I would go for 32. Of course, for people above those needs, I think you probably know what you need at this point. You don't need my advice. So if you need that max GPU, go for it. If you need 64 gigabytes of memory, go for it. And remember to always choose more storage than you think you'll need, because an additional $400 now is better than running out of space, especially if you plan to keep these laptops for a long time. And based on these specs, these laptops should last for years. I'll also say before we end this video, I want to give 2 quick buying recommendations on Apple's other laptops. And I still think for the vast majority of people out there, as in consumers who don't care about the display or ports or power and just want a good, reliable laptop, I would still recommend the M1 MacBook Air over this M1 Pro MacBook Pro. It's basically half the price and is so powerful, it has no fan in it, has better battery life than the 14-inch MacBook Pro, and I think overall is probably going to end up being the better consumer level laptop. And if you're a user thinking about the M1 MacBook Pro, my best advice right now is to just avoid that computer. I think it's the worst value right now in the MacBook lineup because if you realistically look at the price differences between the 13-inch Pro and 14-inch Pro with the same 512GB SSD and 16GB of memory, you only have to pay $300 more to get the 14-inch MacBook Pro, and you will have even better CPU and GPU performance and so many hardware upgrades that it really does make the M1 Pro very hard to recommend. So I would get the M1 Air or just skip right up to the M1 Pro MacBook Pro. These names are a mess. All right. I really hope that this video was helpful in trying to break down this MacBook Pro ordering mess. And I know it wasn't fully comprehensive on every aspect, but for now, this is the best I can do. So if you did find this video helpful, or you just feel bad for me, I feel bad for me at this point, consider hitting that like button. And if you made it this far, you might as well subscribe for a future MacBook Pro review. As always, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care, everyone. My dog's here. Hold on. My dog came in to say hello. This isn't orthodox. This isn't how we usually end a video. Kiki, ask them for a subscriber. If you subscribe to my channel, I will give this dog a treat. For every subscription we get for this video, he will get an extra treat for his snack. Okay, say goodbye. Say bye.